The Vrakthari had ruled the stars for 3,000 years, and in all that time, not a single warrior of their kind had ever known the feeling of fear. Their bodies were built different from other species in the galaxy. Their brains wired in ways that made terror impossible. Their nervous systems unable to create the chemical reactions that would make them hesitate or run away or beg for mercy. This was not courage in the way other races understood it. For courage required the choice to face danger despite being afraid. And the Vrakthari had no such choice to make. They simply did not feel what others felt when death came close for 3,000 years. This had made them unstoppable. Admiral Kethvolume stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the mighty dreadnought called the Unbroken Advance, and he watched through the massive viewing screen as his fleet moved into position around the small blue world that the humans called New Helsinki. 200 warships followed his command, each one crewed by warriors who had never retreated from any battle, who had never surrendered to any enemy, who had never shown weakness of any kind. The Vrakthari Dominion had conquered 17 different species across the galaxy, using this simple truth about their nature: when you cannot feel fear, you cannot be stopped. Kethvol's scales were dark green, almost black, and they covered his tall, muscular body like armor made of living stone. His eyes were yellow with vertical slits that could see in darkness as easily as in light, and his claws were long and sharp, and perfect for tearing through the flesh of those who resisted Dominion rule. He'd lived for 230 standard years, and in that time he had commanded the destruction of countless worlds and the enslavement of millions of beings who had dared to defy the will of the Vrakthari. Would be no different. The humans were a young species, barely a century removed from their first journey beyond their home system, and they had spread to only a handful of colony worlds in that time. They had no great fleet, no powerful allies, no ancient technology to protect them. They were soft creatures with thin skin and weak bodies and short lives, and yet they had refused to kneel. Kethvolume found this almost amusing in a distant way, for the humans had been given every chance to submit peacefully to Dominion authority. Diplomats had been sent with clear terms: surrender your worlds and serve the Vrakthari, or face complete destruction. The response from the human government had been simple and foolish. They had said no. Now here he was with 200 warships ready to teach them the price of that refusal. The colony world below held nearly 3 million human settlers, families who had come to build new lives on a world far from Earth. They had built cities and farms and schools and all the things that young civilizations build when they dream of a future among the stars. Soon, those cities would burn and those dreams would turn to ash. Such was the way of the galaxy under Vrakthari rule. Admiral, his communications officer, called out from across the bridge, "The human defense fleet is moving to intercept our advance." Kethvolume turned his head slightly to look at the tactical display that showed the positions of all ships in the system. The human fleet consisted of 12 vessels, small things that ran on primitive fusion drives and carried weapons that would barely scratch the hull of a proper Vrakthari warship. 12 ships against 200 was not even a battle. It was an execution. They know they cannot win, Kethvolume said in his deep rumbling voice. And yet they come anyway. His second in command, a younger warrior named Drethkai, stepped forward with confusion on his scaled face. "Why would they fight when the outcome is certain, Admiral? It makes no sense to throw away lives for nothing." Kethvolume considered this question for a moment before answering. "They do it because they are afraid," he said. "Fear makes lesser species do irrational things. They fight because running feels worse to them than dying. Their terror blinds them to logic." Drethkai nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. Neither of them could truly understand what fear felt like. They could only observe its effects on others and try to make sense of behaviors that seemed completely insane. Should we attempt communication? Drethkai asked. Perhaps they can be convinced to stand down and spare themselves. No, HFY replied. We gave them their chance to surrender. They chose defiance. Now they must serve as an example to any other species that might think about resisting the Dominion. He turned back to the viewing screen and watched as the tiny human ships moved closer, their engines burning bright as they accelerated toward the massive Rakthari fleet. All ships, advance, HFY ordered. Standard attack formation. Destroy the enemy fleet and then begin orbital bombardment of the primary population centers. The order went out across the fleet, and 200 warships began to move as one. A wall of death rolling toward the small group of defenders who stood between them and the helpless world below. HFY felt nothing at this moment. No excitement, no anticipation, no guilt. He was simply doing what Rakthari had always done, crushing those who were weaker and taking what he wanted. This was the natural order of things. The strong ruled and the weak served or died. It had been this way for 3,000 years, and it would be this way for 3,000 more. The humans were just another species that had failed to understand this simple truth. In a few hours, their defense fleet would be destroyed, their cities would be burning, and the survivors would learn to kneel before their new master. HFY watched the human ships grow larger on his screen, and he waited for the battle to begin. He had no doubt about how it would end. Rakthari had never lost a war, and they never would. This was what he believed with absolute certainty. For how could any enemy defeat a force that could not be frightened, that would never retreat, that would keep fighting until every last opponent was dead? Fear was the great weakness of lesser species, and the Rakthari had no such weakness. They were perfect warriors. In a galaxy full of cowards, as the first weapons began to fire and the first human ships began to die, Admiral HFY stood tall and confident. On his bridge, he had done this 100 times before, and he would do it 100 times again. Nothing in this galaxy could challenge the might of the Rakthari Dominion, nothing at all. The human ships fought like nothing HFY had ever seen before. They were outgunned and outnumbered by a ratio that should have made resistance meaningless. Yet they threw themselves at the Rakthari fleet with a fury that bordered on madness. The first human destroyer, a small vessel called the Stavanger, charged directly at a line of Rakthari cruisers, with all weapons firing plasma. Bolts and missile salvos poured from its launchers in a desperate storm of destruction that managed to damage 2 enemy ships before the return. Fire tore the Stavanger apart in a bloom of fire, and debris. The crew of 93 humans died in an instant. But their sacrifice had bought time for the colony below. Another destroyer called the Reykjavik swept in behind the Rakthari formation and targeted their supply ships, destroying 3 cargo vessels full of ammunition and fuel before a squadron of fighters caught up with it and blasted its engines into scrap. The Reykjavik drifted powerless for 7 minutes while its crew continued to fire whatever weapons still worked, taking 2 more fighters with them before a cruiser finally put them out of their misery. HFY watched all of this from his command bridge with something that might have been interest. If he were capable of such emotions, the humans were dying in great numbers, their ships exploding one after another as the overwhelming firepower of the Rakthari fleet ground them down. Yet they refused to stop fighting, Admiral, Drethkai said with confusion in his voice. The human vessels are not attempting to retreat. They continue to attack even as their fleet is destroyed around them. I told you, HFY replied. Fear makes them irrational. They cannot think clearly when terror clouds their minds. But even as he said this, the Admiral felt a small doubt creep into his thoughts. He had seen fearful enemies before. Species that panicked and ran when they realized they could not win. Species that begged for mercy when death came close. The humans were not doing any of these things. They were fighting with coordination and purpose, sacrificing themselves in ways that seemed planned. Rather than desperate, a human frigate called the Copenhagen positioned itself between a Vrak 3 battleship and a fleeing transport full of civilian evacuees. The frigate took hit after hit, its shields failing, its hull breaking apart. But it held position long enough for the transport to escape into hyperspace with 4,000 colonists aboard. Only when the transport was safely away did the Copenhagen finally die, its reactor going critical in a massive explosion that damaged the battleship that had been trying to push past it. This was not the behavior of terrified creatures acting without thought. This was something else entirely. 2 hours into the battle, 11 of the 12 human ships had been destroyed. Over 1,000 human sailors had given their lives in defense of their colony, and they had managed to evacuate perhaps 50,000 civilians before the Vrak 3 fleet sealed off all escape routes. It was a tiny fraction of the 3 million people below, but it was more than Kethvolume had expected them to save. The last human ship still active was a frigate called the Ericsson, and it drifted near the edge of the combat zone with its engines dark and its hull bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds. The Ericsson was dying. Anyone could see that. Its power systems flickering and its weapons silent. "Should we finish it, Admiral?" Drethkai asked Ethith. Valoon considered for a moment before shaking his head. "Leave it for now," he said. "Let them watch as we destroy their world. Let that be their punishment for defiance." He turned his attention to the planet below and began issuing orders for the bombardment. The primary cities would be hit first, then the industrial centers, then the food production areas. By the time they were finished, New Helsinki would be a dead world, a warning to any other human colony that thought about resisting. But then something strange happened. The Ericsson, the dying ship the Kethvolume had dismissed as irrelevant, suddenly activated its emergency beacon. The signal went out on all frequencies, powerful enough to reach across the entire star system and beyond. And it carried a single word repeated over and over again. Von Rerg Ethimo did not recognize the word. His translators could not find a proper meaning for it in any galactic language database, and he dismissed it as some kind of human death ritual or final prayer. "Ignore it," he ordered. "Proceed with the bombardment." But his communications officer turned to him with an unusual expression on her scaled face. "Admiral, I am detecting a gravitational anomaly forming at the edge of the system." Kethvolume frowned, which was difficult to do with a Vrak 3 face, but he managed it anyway. "Explain." "It appears to be some kind of spatial distortion," the officer said, her claws moving across her console as she tried to make sense of the readings. "The energy signatures are massive, far beyond anything in our records." "A natural phenomenon?" Drethkai suggested. "Unlikely," the officer replied. "The distortion is too regular, too controlled. It appears to be artificial in origin." Kethvolume felt something then. Not fear, because that was impossible for him, but perhaps uncertainty. The Vrak 3 had mapped this region of space thoroughly, and there was nothing near this system that could cause such readings. No black holes, no quantum storms, no ancient alien artifacts left over from dead civilizations. There was nothing here except a human colony world and a Vrak 3 fleet. Nothing that should be causing gravitational distortions of this magnitude. "Put it on the main screen," Kethvolume ordered. The viewing screen shifted to show the edge of the star system, where the anomaly was forming. At first there was only darkness, the empty void between stars that had existed unchanged for billions of years. Then the darkness began to twist. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp as something massive pushed through from somewhere else, somewhere that should not exist according to all known physics. A crack appeared in the fabric of space. A wound in the universe that glowed with strange light, and from that wound, something emerged. Kithel stared at the screen, and for the first time in his 230 years of life, he felt his secondary heart skip a beat. The thing that came through the rift was a ship, a human ship, but it was unlike any human vessel the Vractari had ever recorded. It was enormous, nearly 6 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with weapons that defied immediate classification. Its hull was black as the void itself, scarred and pitted and ancient-looking, as if it had survived wars that made this battle look like a minor disagreement. Painted across its bow in stark white letters was a name that HFY could now understand: UNS FNRI, the dying frigate. Erickson had not been sending a prayer, it had been sending a summons, and something had answered. The bridge of the unbroken advance fell silent as every Vractari officer stared at the massive vessel that had torn its way through reality itself. Gethvalum gripped the armrests of his command chair with claws that left deep scratches in the metal. His mind raced to understand what he was seeing, to fit this impossible ship into the framework of everything he knew about humans and their primitive technology. It could not be real. The humans had nothing like this. Their largest warships were barely a kilometer long, and their weapons technology was generations behind the Vractari. And yet there it was, hanging in the void like a predator that had just found its prey. "Admiral," his tactical officer said in a voice that trembled slightly, which was strange because Vractari voices never trembled. "The vessel is 6.2 kilometers in length, with a mass roughly equivalent to our entire invasion fleet combined." "That is impossible," Drethkai whispered. "Where did they hide such a thing? How did our intelligence fail to discover it?" HFY had no answers. He could only watch as the great black ship began to move, its engines flaring with power that made the stars behind it dim in comparison. "All ships, defensive formation," HFY ordered. "Target that vessel with everything we have." 200 warships turned their weapons toward the Fenrir and opened fire plasma cannons, railguns, missile batteries, energy lances. Everything in the Vractari arsenal screamed across space toward the human vessel in a storm of destruction that should have been enough to crack a planet. The Fenrir did not even try to dodge it, flew straight through the barrage as if the weapon's fire was nothing more than rain, its shields absorbing impacts that would have vaporized any other ship in existence. A few shots got through, leaving scorch marks and small craters on that ancient black hull. But the Fenrir did not slow down. It did not fire back either. It simply kept coming, closing the distance between itself and the Vractari fleet with terrible patience. "Why is it not attacking?" Drethkai asked. "It has the firepower to destroy us. Why does it hesitate?" HFY did not know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him in ways he could not describe then. The Fenrir broadcast its message. It was not words. There were no sounds, no images, no data streams that the Vractari could intercept and analyze. Instead, something reached directly into the minds of every Vractari in the fleet, bypassing their ears and eyes and going straight to the deepest parts of their brains. HFY felt it hit him like a physical blow. Emotion raw, overwhelming, utterly alien emotion poured into his consciousness in a flood that threatened to drown everything he was. For one terrible moment, he felt what humans felt. He felt the terror of colonists watching Vractari ships appear in their sky. He felt the helplessness of parents trying to shield their children from bombardment. He felt the rage of survivors standing in the ashes of their homes. He felt the despair of prisoners being dragged into the minion slave camps, but most of all, he felt Farkith. William had never known fear. His brain was not built to produce it. His species had evolved without this basic survival mechanism that plagued every other sentient being in the galaxy. Now, something was forcing that experience into him from the outside, making him feel what his biology had always prevented. It was agony. It was worse than any physical pain he had ever experienced because it touched something deeper, something that should not exist in a Vrakthari mind. He heard screaming on the bridge and realized that his officers were feeling the same thing. Drethkai had fallen to his knees. His claws pressed against his skull, as if trying to keep his brain from exploding. The communications officer was making a sound that Keth Volume had never heard any Vrakthari make before. A high-keen wail of pure animal terror all across the fleet. The same scene was playing out on every ship. Warriors who had never known a moment of hesitation in their lives were suddenly drowning in emotions they had no ability to process or control. The Fenrir was still not firing its weapons. It did not need to. The weapon it carried was something far worse than any cannon or missile. Humanity had studied the Vrakthari for decades, analyzing every piece of information they could gather about their ancient enemy. They had learned that Vrakthari fearlessness was not true courage. It was a neurological limitation, a quirk of brain chemistry that prevented them from experiencing certain emotions, and humanity had found a way to bypass that limitation. The Fenrir's primary weapon was an empathy projector, a device that could broadcast emotional states directly into the minds of any sentient being within range. It did not create artificial emotions, it transmitted real ones. Feelings that Keth Volume was experiencing right now were not simulations or illusions. They were the actual emotions of the human crew aboard the Fenrir. Marines and sailors who had volunteered to serve on the most terrifying ship in the human fleet. Those humans were thinking about the Vrakthari right now. They were remembering every atrocity, every massacre, every child burned in an orbital strike, every family torn apart by slavers, every world left dead and lifeless by Dominion conquest. They were feeling all the rage and grief and terror that humanity had accumulated over years of Vrakthari aggression, and the Fenrir was pouring those emotions directly into the minds of the enemy. Keth Volume tried to stand, tried to regain control of himself, tried to remember that he was an admiral of the Dominion, and that Vrakthari did not surrender, but his body would not obey. His legs shook, his heart pounded, his vision blurred with something wet that he realized must be tears. Though he had never cried in his entire life, he was afraid for the first time in 230 years. Admiral Keth Volume was truly, completely, utterly afraid, and around him, his entire fleet was falling apart. Ships broke formation as crews panicked. Officers abandoned their posts. Warriors attacked each other in blind terror. Vessels collided as helm operators fled from their consoles. The fearless Vrakthari, the conquerors of 17 species, the masters of the Orion Spur for 3,000 years. They were screaming, they were weeping, they were running, and the wolf had not even begun to hunt. The battle lasted 19 minutes. In those 19 minutes, everything the Vrakthari believed about themselves was torn apart and scattered like ashes in a storm. Keth Volume watched from the bridge of the unbroken Advance as his fleet destroyed itself. Ships that had fought together for decades suddenly turned their weapons on each other as panic gunners fired at anything that moved. Cruisers collided with destroyers as navigation officers fled their posts in blind terror. Shuttles launched from hangar bays crammed with warriors desperate to escape, only to be caught in the crossfire and vaporized. The Fenrir moved through this chaos like a dark god, walking among insects. Its weapons were devastating. Rail cannons that punched through Vrakthari armor as if it were made of paper. Energy beams that cut battleships in half with surgical precision. Swarms of autonomous drones that overwhelmed point defense systems and tore through hull plating, but the weapons were almost secondary to the true horror of what was happening. Every time the Fenrir destroyed a ship, the emotional broadcast intensified. Every explosion, every death, every moment of destruction fed back into the minds of the surviving Vractari as confirmation of their worst fears. This was real. This was happening. They were going to Decathlum had lost contact with most of his fleet within the first 5 minutes. Communication systems failed as operators abandoned their stations. Command structures collapsed as senior officers succumbed to the psychological assault. Entire ship crews simply stopped functioning as the weight of unfamiliar terror crushed their ability to think. Some Vractari fought back against the fear. A handful of captains managed to hold their crews together long enough to organize some kind of resistance, firing back at the Fenrir with weapons that barely scratched its massive hull. These ships lasted longer than the others, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 minutes, before the combination of direct weapons fire and intensified emotional assault finally broke them. One battleship, the Eternal Victory, actually managed to land a solid hit on the Fenrir, its main cannon tearing a chunk out of the human vessel's starboard side. For a brief moment, Keth Volume felt hope surge through him, but then the Fenrir turned its attention to the Eternal Victory and the hope died. The human ship did not just destroy the battleship, it took its time. Railgun rounds shattered the Eternal Victory's engines first, leaving it drifting and helpless. Then the drones came, thousands of them, swarming over the hull and cutting through it piece by piece. The Vractari crew tried to fight back, tried to repel the drone assault, tried to do anything to stop what was happening. The Fenrir made them watch. The emotional broadcast shifted, focusing specifically on the Eternal Victory, forcing its crew to experience not just generic terror, but the specific emotions of every human who had ever watched a Vractari ship tear apart a civilian transport. Helplessness, despair, the knowledge that no help was coming. When the Eternal Victory finally exploded, Keth Volume felt something break inside him, not his body. His body was unharmed, still standing on the bridge of a ship that had somehow avoided destruction so far. What broke was something deeper: his certainty, his identity, his understanding of what he was and what his species meant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. The Vractari were supposed to be the apex predators of known space. They were supposed to be the ones who inspired terror in others. They were supposed to be fearless, but here was this human ship, this ancient black wolf, teaching them the truth. They were not fearless. They had simply never encountered anything worth fearing. Humanity had looked at the Vractari, studied them, analyzed them, and asked a simple question: what happens when the monsters meet something worse? Now Keth Volume knew the answer. The monsters screamed, the monsters cried, the monsters begged for mercy that would not come. Keth Volume was alone on his bridge. Now his officers had fled or killed each other, or simply collapsed into catatonic heaps of scaled flesh and shattered minds. The unbroken advance drifted without power, its systems failing one by one as the skeleton crew that remained proved unable to maintain basic functions. Through the viewing screen, Keth Volume could see the wreckage of his fleet. 200 warships reduced to debris and corpses in less than 20 minutes. The greatest military force the Dominion had sent against the humans, destroyed not by superior firepower or clever tactics, but by the simple act of making them feel what every other species in the galaxy felt every day: fear. The dear Fenrir loomed before him now, its massive form blocking out the stars, its hull scarred but unbroken. Volm knew he should feel rage. He should feel the burning need for vengeance that had driven Vractari warriors for 3,000 years, but all he felt was tired and small and very afraid. He reached for the communication console with shaking claws and activated the emergency broadcast system. His message would reach the Dominion homeworld in a matter of days, carried by faster-than-light relay stations that spanned the Empire. He did not know what to say at first. How could he explain what had happened here? How could he describe the feeling of fear to a species that had never known it? In the end, he kept it simple. "This is Admiral Kethvolume of the Invasion Fleet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our forces have been destroyed. I am the only surviving commander." He paused, searching for the right words. "Do not wake them," he continued. "Do not provoke them. Do not give them a reason to come for us." Another pause. "The humans are not prey. They are not victims. They are not what we thought they were." He looked up at the Fenrir one last time, at the massive black ship that had shattered everything he believed. They are the thing that hunts the hunters. The transmission ended. Kethvolume sat back in his chair and waited for death to come, but the Fenrir did not fire. Instead, it simply turned away and began moving toward the colony world below. The world that Kethvolume had come to destroy. The world that humanity had just saved. The Admiral sat alone in the dark, surrounded by the bodies of his crew and the wreckage of his ambitions. And he wept for the first time in Vractari history. A warrior of the Dominion wept, and somewhere in the black depths of space, the Wolf moved on to protect its pack. The news of what happened at New Helsinki spread across the galaxy like wildfire burning through dry grass within days. Every species in known space had heard some version of the story of Vractari invasion fleet of 200 warships, destroyed in less than 20 minutes by a single human vessel. Warriors who had never known fear, reduced to screaming, weeping, helpless creatures who could not even fight back the fearless conquerors of the Orion Spur, broken by a ship that made them feel what their victims had always felt at first. Many did not believe it. The Vractari had ruled for 3,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever defeated them so completely. Surely the reports were exaggerated. Surely the humans had some secret fleet hidden somewhere. Surely there was some logical explanation that did not involve the impossible. But then the recordings began to surface, footage from Vractari, ships that had survived long enough to transmit their final moments back to Dominion space. Video of officers screaming in languages that had no words for the emotions they were experiencing. Audio of Admiral Kethvol's final transmission, his voice breaking as he warned his people not to provoke the humans. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy understood something fundamental had changed. The 17 species that had lived under Vractari rule for generations saw their master's fearless image crumble. These were the warriors who had burned their cities and enslaved their children. These were the conquerors who had seemed as inevitable and unstoppable as death itself. And now here they were, crying like frightened animals, begging for mercy, running from a single human ship. The rebellions began within weeks on a dozen worlds. Subject species rose up against their Vractari overlords, finding courage in the knowledge that the fearless ones could in fact be made to fear. Some of these rebellions failed, crushed by Vractari forces that had not yet faced the psychological weapon of the Fenrir, but many succeeded, because the Vractari sent to suppress them were not the same warriors they had been before. New Helsinki doubt had crept into the Dominion for the first time in 3,000 years. Vractari soldiers wondered if they might face something that could make them feel what those 200 ships had felt. And that doubt was almost as crippling as the fear itself. The Galactic Council, a loose assembly of neutral species that had long avoided any conflict with the Dominion, demanded answers from Earth. How had humanity developed such a weapon? How had they hidden such a massive vessel from all galactic intelligence services? What were their intentions now that they had proven themselves capable of defeating the most feared military force in known space? The human ambassador who answered these questions was a woman named Yuki Tanaka. She was small by human standards, soft-spoken, with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed completely at odds with the terrifying power her species had just displayed. She stood before the council and spoke in a calm voice that carried to every corner of the great chamber. "You ask how we developed psychic weapons," she said. "But we did not develop psychic weapons." The council members shifted in confusion. "The Fenrir does not create artificial emotions or implant false feelings into enemy minds," Tanaka continued. "It simply broadcasts what its crew actually feels." She paused to let this sink in. "The humans who serve aboard the Fenrir are volunteers. Marines and sailors who lost family to Vractari attacks, survivors of Dominion raids. People who carry the memories of what your fearless conquerors did to innocent civilians." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. "When the Fenrir engages an enemy, its crew thinks about those memories. They think about the children who died in orbital strikes, the families torn apart by slavers, the worlds left as burned-out husks." She looked around the chamber at the representatives of 100 different species. They feel rage. They feel grief. They feel terror. And the Fenrir's empathy projector broadcasts those emotions to anyone within range. Ugh. Vractari delegate rose to protest, but Tanaka kept speaking. "The Vractari at New Helsinki did not feel our hatred or our anger. They felt what our people felt when Vractari ships appeared in their skies." She let the silence stretch for a long moment. They experienced, for the first time in their evolutionary history, what it means to be on the receiving end of a Vractari raid. The chamber was completely quiet now. "We did not make them afraid of us," Tanaka said. "We made them afraid of themselves. We showed them what they truly are when viewed through the eyes of their victims." The Vractari delegate finally found his voice. "This is a war crime," he snarled. "Using psychological weapons against enemy combatants violates every treaty in existence." Tanaka turned to face him with an expression that might have been pity. "Your species burned 7 human colonies," she replied. "You killed over 40 million of our people, including children. You never declared war. You simply attacked because you wanted our resources and knew we could not stop you." She took a step toward him. "You do not get to lecture us about war crimes." The delegate sat down without another word after the council session ended. Reporters from a dozen different species crowded around Tanaka, shouting questions about humanity's intentions and the future of galactic politics. One question cut through the noise. Asked by a young journalist from one of the formerly subjugated species, "What happens now? Will humanity use the Fenrir to conquer the galaxy, as the Vractari did?" Tanaka smiled, and for a moment she looked like someone's grandmother, rather than the representative of a species that had just humiliated the most powerful military force in known space. "The Fenrir has returned to Earth," she said. "It will remain in reserve unless it is needed again." "Needed for what?" "To remind anyone who might forget the lesson of New Helsinki," Tanaka replied. "The Vractari were not fearless. They simply had never met anything worth fearing." She looked directly into the camera. "Humanity hopes the Fenrir will never be needed again. We did not build it because we wanted to conquer or dominate. We built it because we had no other choice." Her voice softened. "But let me be clear about something. We remember every world the Dominion burned, every family they destroyed, every child they killed. Humanity remembers, and if anyone threatens our people again, if anyone thinks that we are weak or primitive or easy prey," she paused, "they will meet the wolf." In the years that followed, the galaxy reorganized itself around this new reality. The Vractari Dominion did not collapse immediately, but its power waned as subject species gained independence and former allies distanced themselves. Humanity remained a relatively small player in galactic politics, preferring trade and diplomacy over expansion and conquest, but everyone knew what waited in orbit around Earth. Everyone knew what would happen if humanity was pushed too far. The fearless image of the Vractari had crumbled at New Helsinki. replaced by the image of warriors weeping and screaming as they experienced emotions their species had never evolved to handle, and in its place, a new image had emerged: humanity. The species that had looked at the galaxy's greatest predators and asked a simple question: what happens when the monsters meet something worse? The Wolf slept now, dreaming in its orbital dock, its ancient hull silent and still, but the galaxy did not forget. The galaxy would never forget. And, somewhere in the cold depths of space, the descendants of the Vrakthari told their children stories about the human ship that had taught their ancestors to fear. They called it by its human name, pronounced with reverence and terror: Fenrir, the wolf that had eaten the fearless.